Chapter 2. Hell is Cold. Between two worlds, life hovers like a star. Twixt night and morn, above the horizon's verge, how little do we know that which we are, how less we may be. Lord Byron, Don Juan. "You stupid little girl," Miss Black spat out as she jerked tight the knots holding Tessa's wrist to her bed frame. "What did you think you were going to accomplish, running away like that? Where did you think you could possibly go?" Tessa said nothing, simply set her chin and looked toward the wall. She refused to let Miss Black or her horrible sister see how close she was to tears, or how much the ropes binding her ankles and wrists to the bed hurt. "She is entirely insensible of the honor being done to her," said Miss Dark, who was standing by the door as if to make sure Tessa didn't rip free of her bonds and rush out through it. "It is disgusting to behold. We have done what we can to make her. We have done what we can for her to make her ready for the magister," Miss Black said and sighed. "A pity we had such dull clay to work with. Despise her talents. She is a deceitful little fool." "Indeed," agreed her sister. "She does realize, doesn't she, what will happen to her brother if she tries to disobey us again? We might be willing to be lenient this time, but the next—" She hissed through her teeth a sound that made the hairs rise up on the back of Tessa's neck. "Nathaniel will not be so fortunate." Tessa couldn't stand it any more, even knowing she shouldn't speak, shouldn't give them the satisfaction. She couldn't hold the words back. "If you told me who the magister was, or what he wants with me—" "He wants to marry you, you little fool." Miss Black finished with the knots, stepped back to admire her handiwork. "He wants to give you everything." "But why?" Tessa whispered. "Why me?" "Because of your talent," Miss Dark said. "Because of what you are and what you can do. What we trained you to do. You should be grateful to us." "But my brother—" Tears burned behind Tessa's eyes. "I will not cry. I will not cry. I will not cry," she told herself. "You told me if I did everything you said, you'd let him go. Once you marry the magister, he'll give you whatever you want. If that's your brother, he'll give it to you." There was no remorse or emotion in Miss Black's voice. Miss Dark chuckled. "I know what she's thinking. She's thinking that if she can have anything she wants, whatever she wanted, she'd have us killed. Don't waste your energy, even imagining the possibility," Miss Black chuckled. Tessa under the chin. "We have an ironclad contract with the magister. He can never harm us, nor would he want to. He owes us everything for giving him you." She leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a whisper. "He wants you healthy and intact. If he didn't, I'd have you beaten bloody. If you dare disobey us again, I'll defy his wishes, and I'll have to whip you until your skin peels off. Do you understand?" Tessa turned her face to the wall. There had been a night on the Main as they'd passed Newfoundland when Tessa had not been able to sleep. She had gone out onto the deck to get a breath of air, and had seen the night sea ablaze with white glittering mountains, icebergs. One of the sailors had told her as he'd passed, broken loose from the ice sheets of the north by the warmer weather. They had drifted slowly on the dark water like the towers of a drowned white city. Tessa had thought that she'd never seen such a lonely sight. She had only begun to imagine loneliness, she knew now. Once the sisters left, Tessa discovered she no longer felt like she wanted to cry. The pressure at the backs of her eyelids was gone, replaced by a dull feeling of hollow despair. Miss Dark had been right. If Tessa could have killed them both, she would have. She pulled experimentally at the ropes, tying her legs and arms to the bedposts. They didn't budge. The knots were tight enough to dig into her flesh and make her hands and feet tingle and shiver with pins and needles. She had a few minutes, she estimated, before the extremities went dead entirely. Part of her, not a small part, wanted to stop struggling, to lie there, limply, until the magistrate came to take her away. The sky was already darkening outside the small window. It couldn't be much longer now. Perhaps he really did want to marry her. Perhaps he truly wanted to give her everything. Suddenly, she heard Aunt Harriet's voice in her head. "When you find a man you wish to marry, Tessa, remember this. You will know what kind of man he is, not by the things he says, but by the things he does." Aunt Harriet had been right, of course. No man she would ever want to marry would have arranged to have her treated like a prisoner and a slave, imprisoned her brother, and had her tortured in the name of her talent. It was a travesty and a joke. Heaven only knew what the magistrate wanted to do with her once he had his hands on her. If it was something she could survive, she imagined she would soon enough wish she hadn't. God, what a useless talent she had. The power to change her appearance. If only she had the power to set things on fire, or shatter metal, or cause knives to grow out of her fingernails. Or if she only had the power to make herself invisible, or shrink herself to the size of a mouse. She went suddenly still. So still that she could hear the ticking of her clockwork angel against her chest. She didn't have to shrink herself down to the size of a mouse, did she? All she had to do was make herself small enough that the ties around her wrists would be loose. It would be possible for her to change into someone a second time without touching something that had belonged to them, as long as she'd done it before. The sister had made her memorize how to do it. For the first time she was glad of something they'd forced her to learn. She pressed herself back against the hard mattress and made herself remember the street, the kitchen, the movement of the needle, the glow of the gaslight. She willed it on, willed the change to come. "What's your name?" "Emma." "Emma Baylis." The change bore down on her like a train, almost knocking the breath out of her, reshaping her skin, reforming her bones. She choked back her screams and arched her back. It was done. Blinking, Tessa stared up at the ceiling, then glanced sideways, staring at her wrist, and the ropes tied around it. There were her hands, Emma's hands, thin and frail. The circle of the rope loose around her small wrists. Triumphantly, Tessa jerked her hands free and sat up, rubbing the red marks where the ropes had burned her skin. Her ankles were still tied. She leaned forward, her fingers working quickly at the knots. Miss Black, it turned out, could tie knots like a sailor. Tessa's fingers were bloodied and sore by the time the ropes fell away and she sprang to her feet. Emma's hair was so thin and fine that it had slipped free of the clips holding Tessa's own hair back. Tessa pushed her hair back impatiently over her shoulders and shook herself free of Emma, letting the change wash away from her until her hair slid through her fingers, thick and familiar to the touch. Glancing at the mirror across the room, she saw that little Emma Baylis was gone, and she was herself again. A noise behind her made her whirl. The knob of the bedroom door was turning, twisting back and forth, as if a person on the other side were having difficulty getting it open. "Miss Dark," she thought. The woman was back to whip her until she was bloody, back to take her to the magistrate. Tessa hurried across the room, seized the porcelain jug from the washstand, and then scuttled to the side of the door, the jug gripped hard in her whitened fist. The knob turned, the door opened. In the dimness all Tessa could see was shadows, as someone stepped into the room. She lunged forward, swinging the jug with all her strength. The shadowy figure moved as quick as a whip, but not quick enough. The jug slammed into the figure's outstretched arm, flying before Tessa's grasp to crash into the far wall. Broken crockery rained down onto the floor as the stranger yelled. The yell was undeniably a masculine one. So was the flood of cursing that followed. She backed away, then dashed for the door, but it had slammed shut, and tug as she would on the knob, it wouldn't budge. Bright light blazed through the room as if the sun had risen. Tessa spun, blinking away the tears in her eyes, and stared. There was a boy standing in front of her. He couldn't have been much older than she was, 17 or possibly 18. He was dressed in what looked like workman's clothes, a frayed black jacket, trousers, and tough-looking boots. He wore no waistcoat, and thick leather straps crisscrossed his waist and chest. Attached to the straps were weapons, daggers and folding knives, and things that looked like blades of ice. In his right hand he held a sort of glowing stone. It was shining, providing the light in the room that had nearly blinded Tessa. His other hand, slim and long-fingered, was bleeding where she had gashed the back of it with her pitcher. But that wasn't what made her stare. He had the most beautiful face she had ever seen. Tangled black hair and eyes like blue glass, elegant cheekbones, a full mouth, and long, thick lashes. Even the curve of his throat was perfect. He looked like every fictional hero she'd ever conjured up in her head, although she'd never imagined one of them cursing at her while shaking his bleeding hand in an accusing fashion.